As I promised you, or threatened you, if you want to look at it that way, at the end of the last video, we're going to talk about dynamic VLANs for just a few minutes, but I want to show you a handy command that will knock down the number of VLANs you're looking at when you just need to see the ports that are in one particular VLAN. Because the VLAN tables we looked at earlier, they were pretty straightforward. We had two VLANs we created, we had our 5 defaults, and we had only moved 2 ports. But here I created a couple of extra VLANs during the break. I renamed VLAN 20 and I moved some ports into these new VLANs. And you would be surprised how often people look at this and their eye skips up a line as it goes across. I think it's because of the way the ports are all displayed on the right hand side. They're all kind of jumbled. So, or on all top of, really on top of each other. So it's easy to say, okay, I'm looking for the ports in VLAN 35. And your eye goes across and you see 35, Green Bay, active, and then your eye skips up a line and it says fast 09. And one little trick I like to use to avoid that is using the mark. You just do a right click. Let me do that a little slower. Do your mark and then just click and drag. And if you drag straight across, that's really helpful because then your eye really can't skip up a line and you can see exactly which port or ports are in that particular VLAN. Another way to do it is to use the show VLAN ID command and then just put the number of the VLAN right after it. And you're going to get the remote span VLAN information that you might not need, but what I do like about this is at the very top of the output it says here's the number you put in, here's the name of that VLAN, here's the status, and here are the ports. And that's really all you need to get started with verification and with troubleshooting. So just a little bonus command there for you. I really like that one. Now, let's talk about these dynamic VLANs for just a few minutes because the actual config of these is way out of the scope of the exam. But you want to be familiar with the basics of the VLAN Membership Policy Server, VMPS. We saw that in some iOS help output in an earlier video. And this is really the core of dynamic VLAN configuration. Now, static VLANs, we use them all the time. There's no real problem with them, but they can be a little clumsy when you need to move a host from one port to another. And let's say that a problem has come up on port 4 and we just need to move that host to port 5. Now physically, of course, we're just going to pull that little port right out of there, pull the cable out of the one port, put it in port 5. But then we've got to go back and manually configure port 5 for that host with the switch port mode access command and switch port access VLAN 12, assuming we're working with VLAN 12. And as good network admins, of course, we would keep up with our network housekeeping and remove the config from port 4 that has to do with that port being in VLAN 12. Here, I just did that and I left port 4 as an access port. When you run no switch port access VLAN, by the way, and you put the VLAN that the port was in, it's going to be put back into the default VLAN, VLAN 1. Now, you look at that and you might think, what's the big deal, Chris? You getting lazy on us? And I'm definitely not getting lazy on you. I certainly admit it's not a ton of work, but it is a simple fact. The more manual configuration you do, the larger a chance of a simple misconfiguration, which just throws a little gasoline on the fire. Now you got a little more troubleshooting to do, especially when somebody is literally leaning over your shoulder to see what you're doing, or they're yelling at you while you're doing it, which always adds to the festivities, right? All you have to do in this situation is enter 21 for 12 on that port 5 config, and what have you just done? You've created some extra troubleshooting for yourself, because then that guy's going to go back and say, hey, I still can't get on the network, etc. Wouldn't it be great if you could just detach that cable from port 4, plug it into port 5, and the VLAN membership is adjusted automatically? Of course it would be. Well, that's what VMPS brings to the table, because what VMPS does, it uses the source MAC address of incoming frames to determine the VLAN membership of the port receiving those frames, so simply moving the cable is all we really have to do. Now in this situation, when the switch sees frames coming into port 5 with a source MAC address that is in its MAC address table as belonging to port 4, the switch will realize what's happened and say, hey, wait a minute, somebody moved that cable on me, and it will not only update its MAC address table, which we would expect, but it will dynamically change the VLAN membership of port 5. We don't have to do anything except move that cable, and that's pretty sweet. Sorry about the little gap here, but we'll get around that. Just some VMPS notes and a little bit of review. There is an odd default I want you to know about, and that is that port fast is automatically enabled for a port when it gets its VLAN membership dynamically. That's interesting. Now, you can certainly take it off if you want to, if there's a reason to, but it is automatically enabled. Just a quick reminder, if it's been a while since you've looked at STP, Spanning Tree Protocol, port fast allows a port to go straight from blocking mode to forwarding mode. And this is a huge help when the host is having problems getting an address via DHCP. I've always been surprised at how often that ends up being the problem, is the STP process is taking too long. You put port fast on that port that's leading to the host, and you're all set. Now, the VMPS server must be configured before you dynamically assign any VLAN membership. Yeah, I know you're saying, well, yes, thank you, Captain Obvious, for that report, but it is in Cisco's best practices, so I wanted to mention it. Now, port security, we have not used that in this course yet, and we're certainly going to. You likely, hopefully, remember from your CCNA studies, port security, it's just when we're basically using the source MAC address of incoming frames on a port as a kind of password. Well, it's a great feature, but if you're using port security on a port, that port can't get its membership. It can't use a dynamic VLAN membership. It's got to be statically set. You would actually have to disable port security on that port in order for that port to get a dynamic VLAN assignment. Finally, one more thing here that we can't do. Trunk ports cannot get a dynamic VLAN assignment, since by definition trunk ports already belong to all VLANs. So that's that right there. So again, port security and trunk ports, ports using those features or ports configured with those features cannot get an VLAN assignment dynamically. Now, I've got a bonus video coming up for you this early in the course, right? Got a troubleshooting video coming up. Little something I ran into in the lab when I was setting up an earlier lab for you. So in the very next video, I'll explain the setup, and then hopefully you can help me figure it out. I'll see you there.